stand with me on the field near Manzikert, in the hills of eastern Anatolia, on the 26th of August, 1071. Below you, an army built from a dozen different peoples, Byzantine regulars, Norman knights, Pecheneg horsemen, Varangian guardsmen carrying axes from a country most of them have never seen, prepares to face a Seljuk force under a sultan whose name alone, Brave Lion, already tells you something about the reputation he has built. By nightfall, an emperor of Rome's eastern half will be a prisoner in a foreign camp. Byzantine chroniclers writing decades later will call this the day their empire's long decline truly began. What does it actually take for a defeat that costs an empire almost nothing on the battlefield itself to become remembered as the disaster that ended it? If you want the real, verified story of Manzikert and the difference between what actually happened there and what later history decided to blame it for, subscribe now. There's more of exactly this waiting for you. To understand Romanos IV Diogenes, the emperor who leads this campaign personally rather than delegating it, you have to understand how unusual his own path to power already was. Romanos rises to the throne in 1068, not through birthright or military coup in the usual sense, but through marriage to Eudokia, the widowed empress herself, a political arrangement that instantly makes him a rival to her late husband's own family, the Doukai, one of Constantinople's most powerful and deeply entrenched political dynasties. That marriage is not simply an inconvenience to the Doukas family. Eudokia's late husband, Emperor Constantine X, had extracted a solemn oath from her before his death, one binding her never to remarry and guaranteeing that the throne would pass exclusively to their own sons, rather than to any future husband of hers. Her marriage to Romanos breaks that oath directly and gives the Doukas faction a specific, deeply personal grievance against him that goes well beyond ordinary court rivalry. In their eyes, he is not simply a political competitor, but a man occupying a throne his own wife had sworn before God he would never hold. Romanos is, by most accounts, a genuinely capable and experienced military commander, not a palace favorite playing at generalship. He had spent years building his reputation on the empire's own Danube frontier, fighting nomadic raiders and rising to command the fortified district of Serdica through demonstrated competence rather than court connections. He is exactly the kind of decisive, battle-tested figure the empire's eastern frontier badly needs as Seljuk Turkish pressure intensifies year after year. He is also, from the very first day of his reign, surrounded by a political faction that never fully accepts his right to hold it. The army Romanos leads east to meet that Seljuk pressure reflects exactly how stretched Byzantine manpower has become by this point in the empire's history. It is a genuinely multicultural force, built as much from hired foreign contingents as from native Byzantine regulars. Norman knights seeking fortune far from their own homeland, Pecheneg horsemen from the Balkan frontier, Frankish mercenaries, and the famous Varangian Guard, Norse and increasingly English soldiers serving as some of the empire's most loyal household troops. This diversity is, in one very real sense, a genuine strength, giving Romanos access to skilled fighters from across the known world. It is also a vulnerability that a purely native Roman army of an earlier century would not have carried into battle in the same way. Mercenaries fight for pay and personal advantage first, and loyalty to a foreign emperor second, a distinction that matters enormously the moment a battle actually starts to turn. Facing that army is Alp Arslan, Sultan of the rapidly expanding Seljuk state, a commander whose own reputation for battlefield skill is matched by a personal reputation for something rarer among conquerors of this era: genuine restraint once the fighting actually stops. What almost nobody watching this campaign unfold expects is that Alp Arslan does not actually want this particular war. His real strategic ambition lies south, against the Fatimid rulers of Egypt, a rival he considers the more serious long-term threat to his own growing state. He had already signed a peace agreement with Byzantium only 2 years earlier specifically to keep his northern border quiet, while he pursued that Egyptian campaign. Romanos' advance into contested territory near Manzikert forces a fight neither side had originally planned on having, and it is worth remembering, once you see how this encounter actually ends, that the man about to win it had been trying to avoid it in the first place. Nothing about Alp Arslan's reluctance is obvious, yet as Romanos marches his army toward contested territory near Manzikert, deep in the borderlands both empires claim as their own. Exactly how large either army actually was is even now genuinely difficult to pin down with any real confidence. Medieval chroniclers on both sides had every incentive to inflate the numbers involved. Whichever direction made their own side's performance look most impressive, and centuries of retelling have only widened the gap between the most dramatic figures and what modern historians consider plausible. Older accounts describe a Byzantine host in the hundreds of thousands facing a considerably smaller Seljuk army. Numbers modern military historians treat with real skepticism given what armies of this era could actually feed and move across this terrain. More conservative modern estimates place Alp Arslan's cavalry somewhere in the range of 20 to 30,000 men, facing a Byzantine force that was larger, certainly, and heavily reliant on exactly the mercenary contingents already described, but nowhere near the almost mythical scale later chroniclers claimed for it. If the idea that an empire's mercenary armies can be both its greatest strength and its most dangerous liability interests you as much as it interests us, our members get more of exactly this kind of decision-by-decision breakdown, first and uncut. It's there whenever you want to go further with us. The political fault line running underneath Romanos' own army becomes impossible to ignore as the two forces close on each other. Command of the reserve, the force held back to reinforce the main battle line at its most critical moment, falls to Andronikos Doukas, a member of the very family whose resentment of Romanos' rise to the throne has never actually faded. Whether Andronikos enters this campaign already planning to abandon his emperor, or simply makes that choice once the battle's outcome looks genuinely uncertain, the sources do not let us say with full confidence. What is clear is that the single most consequential command position in Romanos' entire army is held by a man with every personal and political reason to see this campaign fail. Pecheneг horsemen serving within the Byzantine ranks add a second, considerably less subtle betrayal to the day. As the fighting develops, a portion of these mercenary cavalry simply defect outright to the Seljuk side and use horsemen serving alongside them desert in much the same way, exactly the kind of switched loyalty a purely mercenary force always risks, and a native Roman legion of centuries earlier would have been far less likely to produce. Long before either of those defections becomes decisive, the day's fighting itself has already been shaped by tactics Byzantine heavy infantry and cavalry are simply not built to answer efficiently. Seljuk horsemen spend hours drawing Romanos' forces forward with a repeated feigned retreat, appearing to break and flee only to wheel back and loose arrows into pursuing Byzantine ranks the moment they overextend themselves, chasing what looks like a beaten enemy. Some of these withdrawals stretch on so long and so convincingly that they pull Byzantine units well away from the rest of the army's coordinated formation, exhausting men and horses alike, without ever offering a clean, decisive engagement Romanos' heavier forces could actually win outright. By the time evening approaches, the Byzantine army has spent an entire day chasing an enemy that refuses to be caught, worn down by exactly the kind of mobile harassment warfare that Seljuk horse archers had already perfected across a generation of steppe conflict. Now feel the battle actually begin to turn. Romanos' main force pushes forward against Seljuk positions through the afternoon, gaining ground in a fight that for hours gives no clear indication of which way the day will ultimately break. As dusk approaches and the emperor orders his forces to disengage and return to camp for the night, the maneuver that should be a routine, disciplined withdrawal instead, exposes exactly how fragile his command structure actually is. Andronikos Doukas, holding the reserve that exists specifically to cover a moment like this one, does not move to support the withdrawing main force. Worse than simple inaction, a rumor begins spreading through the ranks in this same chaotic window that the emperor himself has already been killed, a rumor several sources trace directly back to Andronikos and his own faction, rather than to any actual battlefield event. Panic takes hold of troops who believe their emperor is already dead and their cause already lost, and the orderly withdrawal Romanos had ordered disintegrates into exactly the kind of disorganized rout that a false rumor, spread at precisely the right moment, is designed to produce. Seljuk forces, reading the disorder immediately, press the advantage the reserve's absence and the chaos of that rumor have just handed them. What follows is less a continued battle than a rapid, comprehensive collapse. Romanos does not flee with the forces already abandoning him. His horse is killed under him in the fighting, and he is wounded in his own sword hand, continuing to fight on foot even after the men around him have scattered, until Seljuk soldiers finally surround and take him captive. An emperor of the Eastern Roman world now a prisoner inside the very camp his army had spent the entire day trying to break. What happens next surprises nearly everyone who has heard the standard version of what conquerors do with captured emperors. Alp Arslan does not humiliate his prisoner. He does not execute him. Contemporary chroniclers record a direct exchange between the two men that has survived remarkably intact across the centuries. Alp Arslan asks Romanos plainly what he would do if their positions were reversed, if the Sultan himself had been brought before him as a captive. Romanos answers honestly, admitting he would likely have killed his prisoner, or at best paraded him through the streets of Constantinople as a trophy. Alp Arslan's reported response is the detail this entire encounter is remembered for. His own punishment, he tells Romanos, will be far heavier than either of those. He forgives him and sets him free. That forgiveness comes with real negotiated terms rather than pure generosity. For roughly a week, Romanos remains Alp Arslan's guest rather than his prisoner in any ordinary sense, reportedly sharing meals directly at the Sultan's own table while the two sides work out the actual price of his freedom. The terms that emerge are specific and substantial without being crushing. The cities of Antioch, Edessa, Hierapolis, and Manzikert itself are surrendered to Seljuk control, a ransom said to run into the millions in gold is agreed upon, and Constantinople commits to an ongoing annual tribute going forward. It is, by the standards of medieval warfare, an almost startlingly restrained outcome for the total defeat of an emperor's personal army and his own capture on the battlefield. A sultan who had never wanted this war in the first place taking the settlement that secured his border and let him return his attention to Egypt, rather than the humiliation his own captive openly admitted he would have inflicted in reverse. If watching a conqueror choose mercy over humiliation, and watching what that mercy actually cost the empire it was extended to, interests you the way it interests us, that same kind of decision-by-decision history is exactly what our members get first, and uncut. The mercy extended to Romanos by his enemy turns out to matter far less than the cruelty waiting for him from his own political rivals back home. While Romanos is still a captive negotiating his release, the Doukas faction in Constantinople moves immediately to depose him in Absentia, installing their own preferred successor before the defeated emperor has even had the chance to return and defend his own position. When Romanos finally does make his way back toward the capital, he returns not to a throne but to a civil war already effectively decided against him. His enemies capture him and have him blinded, a traditional Byzantine method of permanently disqualifying a rival from ever ruling again rather than simply executing him outright. Even by the standards of a punishment already built around cruelty, the specific act is recorded as being carried out badly, requiring multiple attempts by an inexperienced hand, and the wound that results is never properly treated. Exiled afterward to the small island of Prote in the Sea of Marmara, Romanos dies there from the resulting infection on the 4th of August, 1072, less than a year after an enemy sultan had shown him more genuine mercy than his own countrymen ultimately would. Eudokia herself does not escape this political reckoning either. Whether out of genuine hesitation or simple political calculation, she delays formally welcoming her husband back to power once news of his release reaches Constantinople, and that hesitation is exactly the opening her Doukas in-laws needed. Her brother-in-law, John Doukas, moves quickly to have her own son by her first husband, Michael VII, declared sole ruler, making it clear that Romanos's claim will not be honored regardless of any peace treaty he negotiated with Alp Arslan personally. Eudokia is shortly afterward confined to a monastery, and the family whose oath she had broken to marry Romanos in the first place ends up controlling the throne completely, with both the man she married for the empire's sake and the woman herself removed from power within the same year. This is where the popular version of Manzikert's legacy and the version modern scholarship actually supports begin to diverge sharply, and the difference matters. For generations, this battle has been remembered as the single catastrophic military disaster that shattered Byzantine power in Anatolia overnight, the day the empire's long collapse unmistakably began. Careful modern historical analysis treats that framing as considerably overstated. The battle itself, in purely military terms, was not the annihilation later legend describes. Most Byzantine military units survived the day intact and were recorded fighting elsewhere in Anatolia and the Balkans within only a few months of the defeat. The actual military cost of Manzikert, measured in soldiers and territory lost on the day itself, was real but nowhere near as total as the story usually told about it. What genuinely devastated Byzantine power in Anatolia in the years that followed was not the battle, but the civil war that Romanos' fall triggered, and the opportunists that chaos created space for. Chief among them was a Norman mercenary commander named Roussel de Bayeux, a man who had served Byzantium's own army faithfully enough in earlier campaigns to be trusted with real independent command in the first place. Watching Constantinople's central authority tear itself apart in the years following Romanos' fall, Roussel simply stopped waiting for orders from a capital that could no longer reliably issue them, seizing territory for himself across the Anatolian plateau and attempting to carve out an entirely independent statelet, answerable to no one but himself. A mercenary the empire had trusted enough to arm and pay for its own defense became, once that empire's political center genuinely collapsed, one more piece of Anatolia it could no longer hold on to. Modern historians studying this period generally treat Roussel's opportunistic rebellion and the empire's own internal political collapse as considerably more directly responsible for the permanent loss of Byzantine Anatolia than anything that happened on the actual battlefield at Manzikert. Within less than a decade of Romanos' defeat, the empire has lost more than half its remaining manpower and much of the grain-producing territory that had fed Constantinople for centuries, not because of one battle's casualties, but because no one was left holding Anatolia together once its political center tore itself apart. That slow-motion collapse carries consequences reaching well beyond Byzantium's own borders. A generation later, watching Seljuk territory creep to within sight of Constantinople itself, Emperor Alexios I Komnenos sends an urgent appeal west for military help against the Turks, a request that becomes one of the direct triggers for the First Crusade in the final years of that same century. An empire's internal political failure in the years after Manzikert helped set in motion a movement of armies that would reshape the entire Mediterranean world for centuries afterward. The demographic consequence of that same slow collapse outlasts every treaty, every ransom, and every emperor involved in this specific story. The power vacuum that Romanos' fall and the civil war afterward opened across Anatolia becomes the space in which Turkish tribes and settlers move in and put down permanent roots, beginning a demographic and cultural transformation of the peninsula that no later Byzantine military recovery, and there would be partial recoveries, ever fully reverses. The empire holds onto fragments of Western Anatolia for generations yet. The Turkification of the interior that begins in the disorder following Manzikert never meaningfully reverses at all. So why does Manzikert carry the legendary civilization-ending reputation it still holds today, if the battle itself was not the disaster popular memory insists it was? A meaningful share of the blame, or the credit, depending on how you look at it, belongs to the way the story was told afterward, rather than to what actually happened that day. The Byzantine chronicler Michael Attaliets carries unusual authority in shaping that legend, because he was not simply repeating second-hand rumor. He was a senior Byzantine official who had actually accompanied the campaign himself and witnessed a meaningful share of what he later wrote about. That first-hand authority makes his account genuinely valuable as a historical source, and it also makes his clear dramatic and moralizing framing, presenting Romanos' entire campaign as a doomed tragic enterprise from its very beginning, considerably harder for later generations to simply set aside as exaggeration. An eyewitness telling a partisan story is a more persuasive combination than either quality on its own, and it shaped how Byzantine readers understood this battle's significance for centuries afterward. Arab historians writing about the same battle, for entirely different reasons of their own, present Alp Arslan's victory with an equally dramatic, triumphant framing. Between one tradition determined to explain a national tragedy in the most dramatic possible terms, and another eager to celebrate as complete a victory as possible, Manzikert acquired a legendary, civilization-shattering reputation that the actual immediate military and territorial consequences of the day do not, on their own, fully support. None of this means Manzikert was a minor event, or that Romanos' capture carried no real cost. The political humiliation of an emperor taken prisoner on the battlefield, and the civil war his defeat triggered back home, were entirely real, and that civil war's consequences for the empire's stability were considerably more damaging than the battle's actual casualty count. What the more careful modern reading corrects is simpler, and in its own way, more interesting than the legend. This was not one afternoon of fighting that single-handedly ended an empire's grip on Anatolia. It was a defeat that mattered enormously because of what Constantinople's own political class did to itself in response to it, not primarily because of what happened on the field near Manzikert itself. So think back to that field, to an emperor surrounded and taken captive by an enemy who chose mercy over humiliation. You were never simply watching one battle decide an empire's fate in a single afternoon. You were watching a defeat whose real damage was done afterward, by a conqueror's genuine restraint being answered with a rival faction's brutality, by a captured emperor forgiven by his enemy, and then blinded by his own countrymen, by a civil war and an opportunist's private ambition doing more lasting harm to Byzantine Anatolia than Alp Arslan's victory ever actually did on its own. The legend remembers Manzikert as the day everything ended. The evidence remembers it as the day an empire's own political class proved considerably more dangerous to itself than the enemy who had just defeated it. A sultan who never wanted this war forgave the man he defeated in it. A wife bound by a broken oath watched her own family remove both her husband and herself from power within the same year. A mercenary the empire had trusted with its own defense turned that trust into a private kingdom the moment nobody remained to stop him. None of that happened on the battlefield at Manzikert. All of it happened because of what that single afternoon set loose in the years that followed. If this is the kind of history you want more of, the legends checked against what the sources can actually support, the disasters that trace back to a court's own cruelty rather than a battlefield loss, the mercy shown by enemies that turns out to matter less than the betrayal shown by allies, there's another one waiting for you. Click it and walk with us further.